way, I'm still drinking coffee. All right. So, folks, right after we go over this body of water here, we're going to pass by the Dueling Oak on my right, your left. And I do say the Dueling Oak because we lost one of our Dueling Oaks in 1949 in a hurricane. That's really sad because oaks mate for life, right? No. But remember, the Dueling Oak is where Lewis Allard's remains were. When they found out nobody was in his tomb, they tore down his tomb. But there it is. There's the Dueling Oak. Oh my God, that's gorgeous. Best part of the tour. Dark tree-shaped thing. I can die happy now. Okay, good. That building over there is our art museum. There's a rumor that that statue of Lisa is in the basement of our art museum. But there's so much stuff down there, Jimmy Hoffa might be down there too. We don't know. And folks, first cemetery we went to is the most expensive cemetery in New Orleans. That usually gets people's wheels turning a little bit and say, where do the poor people bury their loved ones in New Orleans? And is everybody buried above ground? Well, not everybody is buried above ground in New Orleans, and where the poor people bury their loved ones is in a cemetery called Holt Cemetery. H-O-L-T was founded in 1879 or established in 1879 by Joseph Holt, one of our city health commissioners, so that poor people would have a place to bury their loved ones in New Orleans. But way before that, that was where our slaves were burying their loved ones. Holt Cemetery is 99% in-ground burial. In Holt Cemetery, for $500, you can dig the grave yourself for your loved one. For $1,500, somebody digs the grave for you. It's got to be a shallow grave. Any farther than 3 feet in New Orleans, you're going to hit water. And in Holt Cemetery, you don't have to bury your loved ones in a coffin. You can just get a remains bag from the mortuary. It looks like one of those blue recycling bags. Put them in the ground that way. A lot of headstones in Holt Cemetery are handmade. That's what poor people can afford. But they don't really keep track of who's buried in Holt Cemetery. So as you're digging, you might find other people's remains. The tradition is you put your loved one in the ground, you put those remains in the ground with them. Now, you don't want to move those remains or remove them from the cemetery. I'll tell you why in a moment. But a couple of years ago, there was a woman who called herself a witch. She was taking whole bodies out of Holt Cemetery, selling those body parts online. She was arrested. She's in jail now. And when we're still able to go into that cemetery, somebody in our tour went in with a garden trowel. Apparently, we wanted to get a really neat souvenir from New Orleans. He was arrested as well. But earlier I was talking about voodoo. At least I said voodoo is not demon worship. That's true. Voodoo is a monotheistic religion. They believe in one all-powerful being. That being is so powerful he can't be bothered with us. So there are thousands of lower deities known as the Loa. The Loa are actually the intermediaries between the land of the living and the land of the dead. They're responsible for everything you can think of. But the Loa that I like to talk about on this tour are the Gede. The Gede are the guardians of the dead. They make sure nothing is removed from a cemetery in New Orleans. If you remove something from a cemetery in New Orleans, the Gede come after you. Terrible things happen in your life until you bring it back. You apologize and make an offering. Now, each Loa has their favorite day of the week, their favorite color, their favorite food, their favorite music, and there is a head of that Loa. So when you're conducting a voodoo ceremony, the Loa show up, and as soon as you identify them, you give them their favorite food, their favorite thing to smoke, and most of them go away, except for the Gede. The Gede are the friend that never wants to leave the party. They always want to stick around for an extra drink and extra smoke, and when the Gede show up, there is a sexually charged energy to that ritual, because each Loa also has a head of that Loa. The head of the Gede is the Baron Samedi. You can see him wearing a top hat, dark sunglasses, smoking a cigar. The Baron Samedi is the voodoo deity for sex and death. In his own words, he is the voodoo deity for sex and death because good sex is this close to death. Now, a traditional offering to a Loa in New Orleans starts with rum, tobacco, gold, beads. We offer beads for everything. We have so many of them, we're just trying to get rid of them. Some people can't afford rum, though. So I've seen little bottles of Sutter Home wine, cheap cans of beer, 40s. Not just for the homies, either. You go to the cemetery if you have a court case, if you're buying a house, if something terrible happens to your child, make an offering, and then when you get it, you come back, you make an offering of thanks. Now, voodoo in New Orleans has always been very unique. We had slaves from Congo and Benin. They came here, they brought their type of voodoo. Then we were a French colony. Then when there was a slave uprising in Haiti, they came here, they brought their type of voodoo. And when people got the day off on Sundays, thanks to Code Noir, they went to what was then Armstrong Park, or what was then Congo Square, what is now Armstrong Park. They would drum, they would chant, they would practice their voodoo. That's also where our Native American tribes were spending time on Sunday. That's important because voodoo is an earth-based religion. Those Native American tribes were teaching them our local earth medicine. Voodoo is also a peaceful religion. But the people worshiping around those churches on those Sundays were disturbed by all this drumming and chanting. They forced them to move those voodoo practices outside of the French Quarter. They did. They moved them to that body of water called the Bayou St. John, in which we passed over before. To this day, on June 23rd, the eve of St. John, you can still see hundreds of people out there dressed all in white doing a ceremony known as a head washing ceremony. At the time, they also passed a law that said that Catholicism was the only religion that could be legally practiced in New Orleans, and that forced those voodoo practitioners to masquerade their voodoo as Catholicism, which was pretty easy. Has anybody been in any of our voodoo shops since you've been here? If you had, you would notice there are crucifixes all over the walls. Those are not crucifixes in voodoo, those are crossroads where you make choices throughout your life. And the center of a crucifix or a X is a concentration of power between the land of the living and the land of the dead. But they would hang crucifixes on their wall. People would think they were perfectly good Catholics. Now, voodoo is a monotheistic religion. They have Loa, and Catholicism is monotheistic religion. They have saints. When they were forced to become Catholics, they just turned the Loa into their saints. So, for instance, they would buy a statue of St. Peter. He's at the gates of heaven. He's a gatekeeper. They'd actually be making offerings to the Papa Legba, who is the gatekeeper in voodoo. The name that usually comes up when I talk about voodoo in New Orleans is Marie Laveau. Marie Laveau is our voodoo queen. She is buried in St. Louis #1, our Catholic cemetery, and some people find that odd. But they shouldn't. Marie Laveau was a devout Catholic. She and all of her children were baptized in St. Louis Cathedral. She was also the child of an arrangement that we had in New Orleans called Passage, which was an arrangement between a Creole aristocratic gentleman and an octoroon or a quadroon woman, a woman that was 1/4 or 1/8 black. The arrangement was that this gentleman would buy her a house in her name, give her her own weekly allowance, her own slaves. If they were to have children through this arrangement, they would be his rightful heirs and hold his religion. Marie Laveau's father was Catholic. She was Catholic as well. She learned her earth medicine from one of our root doctors, as we called voodoo priests at the time. But Marie Laveau was also a very shrewd businesswoman. She owned a hair salon and she told people's fortunes. Her clients were the wealthy women around town and their servants. She had a whole network of people providing her with information. So if you went to Marie Laveau to get your fortune told, she already had quite a bit of information about you. Now, most of what you read or see about Marie Laveau says that she was an evil woman, and that's not true. Marie Laveau was a saint. She gave money to the people that needed it the most, helped a lot of people throughout her life, and the traditional voodoo remedy for yellow fever is moldy bread. Ever hear of penicillin? Yeah, she was curing a lot of people with yellow fever while she was alive. Folks, this is our next stop. Please follow me off the bus. If you don't mind, I'll answer that once everybody gets back.
Also said it was Charity Hospital Cemetery.
I'd always rather
yeah, I see
answer
the
a question
charity.
before the entire group, so everybody can let me answer. We still got the lightning and the thunder creating ambiance, but hopefully the rain will hold off. Okay, so I just had a great question. And actually, so I'm going to point out that across the street we have St. Patrick's Cemetery #2. This is St. Patrick's Cemetery #1. And once again, we see those above ground tombs. That is something we inherited from the Spanish and the French, but everybody that could afford to started burying their loved ones in that way for a very practical reason. We have a lot of flooding in New Orleans. Those tombs are sealed up. When those floodwaters come in, those bodies stay right where they are. Those tombs are not sealed up enough that that flood water doesn't seep in. So when the flood waters go back down, there is water coming out of those tombs, and it smells just about as good as you might expect it would. Now the question, if I understand it correctly, is how long after a family line dies out are they able to pass on the tomb to somebody else? Well, the answer is in our Catholic cemeteries, we don't pass on the tombs. In the Catholic cemeteries, they don't. In the private cemeteries, they do resell tombs, but in New Orleans, they never resell the Catholic tombs. Well, that's not true. There is a very, very long, drawn-out process. It might take up to 50 years, and they try to continually contact the family, but that tomb is never resold or reused again. It just falls into disrepair. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. I know it's different in a lot of different places, but in New Orleans, we have a very specific reason for our burial practices and how we do things. So, the other thing we inherited from the French, you might have realized as you're walking around, is the fleur-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis is the sign for French royalty. It is also a religious symbol. It has 3 leaves for the Trinity. In New Orleans, we will slap a fleur-de-lis on anything that stands still long enough, some things that don't. So, if you accidentally drink too much, take a nap on the sidewalk in the French Quarter, you may wake up with a fleur-de-lis drawn on your forehead. That's nicer than what we used to draw on your forehead. So, this is Charity Hospital Cemetery. This is also our Katrina Memorial. Charity Hospital was purposely built to serve the poorest people in New Orleans. It was one of 2 hospitals that was active during Katrina, Memorial being the other one. We tried to identify all of the over 1,100 bodies we recovered after Katrina. There were 86 bodies we could not identify. 80 of those bodies arrived here. This is where we put our Katrina Memorial as well. Please follow me. I'm sorry?
The quarters on the steps of that. Just a little place on the...
Oh, I'm not certain what you're pointing to.
No, there's quarters, yeah.
Oh, quarters.
Yeah.
I'll talk about that in a moment. On the top rail of the fence.
Oh, sorry.
Actually, if you don't mind, folks, remember those quarters, because that plays into something else that I'm going to talk about. One of the last things that I talk about on the tour. On either side of us here are pretty green fields, right? Well, they're actually mass graves. These are what we call Potter's Fields, anonymous burial grounds. So on this side, we have a mass grave of Potter's Field for people that died of yellow fever or influenza outbreaks. On this side, we have another mass grave of Potter's Field for people that donated their bodies for medical research to Charity Hospital. Most of those bodies were cremated, put in the ground that way. And you can read all about it on this plaque here. But on the bottom, it says, Charity Hospital Cemetery is one of the most historically significant yet least known among New Orleans' famous cities of the dead. Cities of the dead is what Mark Twain called our cemeteries in New Orleans. But before they built this memorial, this cemetery was surrounded by barbed wire. Nobody could come in here, but animals were coming in, digging up the bones in those fields. If you don't know, folks, Katrina isn't what caused the damage. The breach of our levees afterwards are what brought all the water in. So when those floodwaters came in, they washed all the headstones from St. Patrick's number 1 next door into these fields. Which was bizarre because there are no headstones now in these fields. There were broken headstones throughout the fields. There was only one headstone that remained intact. They were able to replace all the headstones where they belonged. There is one headstone that is out in the middle of this field. That one was placed there to honor all of the people that were buried in these mass graves. If you do happen to see any movement over there, there are homeless people that come out and they sleep next to our cemeteries. It's a quiet and safe place for them to sleep. They don't bother us, we don't bother them. You follow me? On this rainy night, they may be indoors, but just in case. All right, folks, these are wall vaults. There's one of each of those bodies in each of these vaults. They're blank because, once again, these are the people we could not identify. Even though these are anonymous graves, people still come out, they offer beads, flowers, and wreaths. Because these are some of our own, and we want to make certain they know they haven't been forgotten by us. Please follow me. When they built this memorial, they purposely built it in the shape of the eye of a hurricane, the calm part of the storm. That's what it looked like from an aerial shot. They wanted this to be a meditative place, a Zen garden, if you will, but what you need to understand is that these bodies were in storage facilities on ice for 4 years after Katrina. They didn't want to put them in an anonymous grave somewhere. They wanted to give them an honorable burial. But people would come out here, they'd been met by a man with white hair wearing a blue denim shirt. He would know their names without them having to say anything. He would tell them exactly where to find the remains of their loved ones. One of the tour guides for our company, Deanna, found the remains of her grandmother through this man because her grandmother would bring her out here every Sunday after church. They would stand on the other side of the fence and her grandmother would say, "You come out, you honor and remember these people, keep the light on for them. There's nobody left to do that." So when Deanna's grandmother died during Katrina and they couldn't find her body, of course she came out here to honor that tradition. And that man walked up to her and said, "I knew your grandmother, this is where you find her." That kept happening. That man that had to unlock that storage facility with the bodies in it finally asked for a description of this man. When he got it, he did some research, found out the man's name was Mr. Sims. Mr. Sims had died in 1978. His was the only intact headstone that had washed in from next door. Mr. Sims had worked for the city of New Orleans and Charity Hospital. He was meeting people out here as a spirit, helping them find the remains of their loved ones. Every once in a while on my tour, I get people that see ghosts just like I see you. One night I told that story, a woman nodded her head and said, "Yeah, I saw him between those two wall vaults over there." Thought it was really weird. Our entire group was over here except for that one woman who was standing over there nodding her head like she was talking to somebody. I asked her why and she said, "Mr. Sims stopped me there to tell me the story you just told the rest of the group." This cemetery has become known as a place where you come to find lost things. Anybody heard of a little band called 9 Inch Nails? Trent Reznor lives in our garden district. He told one of our tour guides he was sitting out on one of these benches a couple months ago meditating. A man walked up to him and said, "There was a locket that was supposed to be buried with your grandmother. It's lost, but it's in Baltimore. This is the address. Check the top right-hand dresser drawer." He chartered a flight that day, flew to Baltimore. When he got to that address, it was his cousin's home. What would you do? He broke into his cousin's home. Found that locket exactly where Mr. Sims told him it was going to be. Not everybody thought this was a great use of space, though. Some people wanted to put a bus stop here instead. They started digging. There were 24 traffic accidents within a 48-hour period at that stoplight because ghostly figures in hospital gowns kept running out into the middle of traffic, causing accidents. After that, the city decided to fill in the holes in the fields, plant the grass, put up this memorial. But to this day, cab drivers still get calls for fares out here. Somebody gets in the back of their cab, gives them an address. When they get to that address, the person in the back of their cab realizes their home is no longer there, and they disappear from the back of the cab. We still get reports of ghostly figures with shocked looks on their faces walking down Canal Street towards the quarter. Those are people that died during Katrina. Those floodwaters came in so quickly they didn't realize they were dying. They don't realize they're dead now. We're standing on part of that mass grave right now. The lowest estimate for the number of bodies that's buried here is 100,000. The highest is 150,000. When we kept having those outbreaks, we couldn't put those bodies in the ground individually. We needed to get them in the ground as quickly as possible to avoid contagion. We couldn't count those bodies then. We certainly can't count them now. Follow me around the other side. There's an explanation of what happened during Katrina and how this memorial arrived here. Most of you know enough about Katrina. I'm not going to give you the whole long story. 80% of our city was underwater thanks to the failure of our levee systems, trapping thousands. Over 1,100 citizens lost their lives in the disaster. Most of the deceased were identified and buried by loved ones in private ceremonies throughout the nation. Here lie the remaining, the unclaimed, and unidentified victims of the storm. Hurricane Katrina was August 29, 2005. This memorial was finally built exactly 4 years later. One of the saddest things about this memorial is that people that lived here during Katrina and survived don't know this memorial is here. The day we were dedicating it, Hurricane Gustav was off our coast. That's what everybody's paying attention to. That's why I tell people to take pictures of this memorial. Post it on Instagram, Facebook, wherever you post pictures online so that people know we have a Hurricane Katrina memorial here. But I'm also hoping that somebody will realize that the remains of their loved ones are in these wall vaults. I know that seems like a long shot, but remember I said we had 86 unidentified bodies. Only 80 arrived here because Mr. Sims had already helped 6 families to find the remains of their loved ones. Less than a year ago, there was a woman that came to New Orleans. She had to come out here. She didn't know why. Until she did, and a man walked right up to her. Any guesses what that man looked like? White hair, blue denim shirt. Told her the remains of her uncle were in that wall vault over there. She thought that was ridiculous. Her uncle had never come to New Orleans, but she got the order to open up that vault, compared those remains to the DNA and dental records she had for her uncle. Turns out her uncle had found his way to New Orleans and died during Katrina. Of the 80 bodies we had out here, now we have 79. Mr. Sims has a pretty good record. He has now helped 7 families to find the remains of their loved ones and 1 rock star to find the lost locket. I believe if more people came out here, Mr. Sims would help them also to find the remains of their loved ones or whatever else it is they're looking for. Does anybody have any questions? If not, shall we get back on the bus?
That lights it up. It's down there. What? Mr. Dave, he's behind you. What do you want? A picture of that? Yeah, I read it.
No, she's asking if you wanted a picture of it.
Oh. I started reading it when we got in here. And when we started moving, I caught up to it.
What's Grandpa doing?
Taking his time. Dad, get in the bus.
I think he wants to ask me something.
Surrounded by the dead. Yeah, thank you. And once again, folks, don't forget about those quarters up on the fence, because that does that's part of something I'm going to talk about later on in the tour. But our next cemetery is right down the road. It is one of our Jewish cemeteries, Cemetery Hebra Theolim, which translates as Gates of Prayer. Remember Code Noir, the thing that dictated how our slaves were treated in New Orleans? The first thing Code Noir said was that all Jews were to be expelled from the colony of New Orleans. We had become a Spanish colony. Spain had a long history of anti-Semitism. Now, a lot of Jewish businesses were closed, and some Jews were forced out of New Orleans. Some had to change their names, just become a lot more anonymous. This is the most paranormally active cemetery we visit on this tour. I believe that is because if you keep getting expelled from or asked to leave the place you consider your home, that's going to bring up some feelings. The cemetery is also the combination of 5 different cemeteries. Where those original cemeteries were, people want to build buildings and roads. So if your body is already buried somewhere and needs to be moved, that's going to disturb the spirit as well. And people do feel the residue from those disturbed spirits in this cemetery. Please follow me on the bus.
Sorry guys if my phone dies
I'd
while
like
I'm
to
doing
talk
this
about the
video.
cemetery before we enter, because as I said, this is the most paranormally active cemetery we visit. I tell people to take pictures on the outside because oftentimes people cannot get clear pictures once they enter the cemetery. That is because ghosts manifest themselves by drawing energy from as many different sources as possible. Since we all carry cell phones, that's where they get their energy from. I've had a number of people enter the cemetery with a fully charged cell phone battery, and it drains as soon as they enter. This is a cemetery where you might not be able to get a clear picture because it looks like somebody's shining a flashlight up into your viewfinder. That building over there used to be our mortuary. It also used to be a residence. One of the founders of our company is a paranormal investigator. She says that building was haunted by children. She brought in an EVP, which allows you to hear ghost voices. They wired a teddy bear to sense paranormal activity. They rolled a red ball across the floor. The red ball came rolling right back to them, and the EVP said, "Stop it, Daniel." So they knew that one of the spirits' names was Daniel. Now, this is an escape room and a haunted house known as the mortuary. They have the ghosts that actually are residing in the building. They have manufactured ghosts as well. But in the cemetery, we have seen the ghost of a little boy who may be Daniel. Sometimes he's standing next to a woman who may be his mother. I've heard the giggling and the singing of a little girl. People approached the gate and they were hit with such a wall of anger and sadness they refused to enter this cemetery. We're the only tour company that has permission to enter this cemetery. That is because I am Jewish and the owner of our company is Jewish. We had to talk to the synagogue a number of times, assure them that everybody in our groups would be extremely respectful. So folks, there are 3 tablets on the ground as we enter the cemetery. Those are badly cracked and badly damaged. Up until a month ago, we had all the pieces of those tablets. So I'm going to ask you to please be careful not to walk on those tablets. Please don't sit on or put your feet up on any of our graves. Please follow me.
I'm sorry guys if my phone dies because you were the guy. This is a tour, so anything that you guys miss in my videos is actually real. So, only people I know here are my mom and my grandma. So,
All right, folks, in Judaism, we believe that your coffin has to go in the ground, but with that high water table in New Orleans, that makes it very difficult. So this is a solution that somebody came up with. These are called coping graves. They're raised up 3 feet. There's a lining of concrete which is filled with earth, then the coffin goes in there. So technically they are in 6 feet of earth. Orthodox Jews believe that all of your coffin has to go straight in the ground or your soul can't find its way to heaven. So these coffins did go straight in the ground. But these are much smaller graves. These are the graves of children and infants. This poor family lost one child October 7th, 1884. and another infant September 13th, 1891. Since this is a Jewish cemetery, you're not going to see flowers on the graves. That's how pagan people honored their loved ones. Instead, you'll see rocks, stones, and pebbles. Shells also, because this is New Orleans. At biblical times, they did not have headstones. The high priest, the Kohanim, could not go near a dead body. They would pile up stones on the grave to alert the high priest not to go near there. So some people say the reason we have stones up on top of our grave is because in the Old Testament there's a description of graves and altars as nothing more than a pile of stones. But they are just a way of showing people that you have been here. These people haven't been forgotten. In Judaism, we believe that the soul hovers over the body for quite a long time. The Hebrew word for soul is nephesh. That is the same word as for headstone. Headstones are meant to give the soul a place to reside until they're able to pass on. The headstones in this cemetery are quite a bit more modest because in Judaism it's considered wasteful to spend a lot of money on a headstone. It's also embarrassing for those that cannot afford an expensive headstone. Cemetery is meant to be the only place where everybody's on even ground. Orthodox Jews believe that all the writing on your headstone needs to be in Hebrew. You're not supposed to have pictures or human figures. Those are considered idolatrous, and you're not supposed to list somebody's good attributes on their headstone because they have to live up to those once they pass on. But there are Reformed Jews who are a lot less strict buried in the cemetery, so you'll see some of those on the headstones. But on almost all of them, you'll see these 2 letters over the name. That stands for lies here or is buried here. On the bottom, there are these 5 letters. That is an acronym, first letter in each word in the sentence. The translation is, may they be bound in the eternal binding of life. Even though traditionally you do not put flowers on a grave in New Orleans, everybody does things the special New Orleans way. So they do have an option to put vases on their graves if they want to put flowers there. These tablets that I pointed out over here used to be a legend. They showed you who was buried where in the cemetery. These are completely outdated. But you can see they still say section, row, and grave, and that's where some of those pieces turned up missing about a month ago. That's why I'm so protective of you.
Sorry for missing my tour, but I wouldn't be able to let this video post, so I will sign out here. Let me know if you guys see anything in the videos. Alright, bye guys.